And when I'm sitting over there, I'm thinking just all of the ways that I could go wrong right now. But that got me thinking, especially with Austin going through the graphics up here. We named this ministry Equipped for a reason. We named it because its purpose is for us, young adults, to have a chance to practice and further our ministry in ways that we can't really function within regular Sunday service. And especially with how much it was growing, we really just needed something like that. So that's what this is for not just me, but everybody else, TJ, everybody else, to work in their gifts in ways that they may not be able to on a Sunday morning service. And so I'm up here, I'm really nervous, and I just want to encourage you in that, hey, if you know maybe a direction, you feel God pulling you in a direction to use your gifts, come talk to Blake or someone and see what we can do to help push you further in your ministry. But that being said, today we're continuing our series, The Greatest Story Ever Told. And so let's recap a little bit. First week, I wasn't here, but Blake spoke upon Adam and Eve. And his main point was like, we choose sin. Unfortunately, we are going to choose sin. We are naturally sinful. I wasn't here for that sermon, but I know that because we have it on YouTube, so you can go watch it. Shameless plug. Actually, I didn't watch it. I just asked Blake. But the second week we did Cain and Abel. Blake spoke about Cain and Abel and about how you have to take control of your pride and self-control. Otherwise, those things will eat you up, and will eat you up, tear you up, and spit you out. And that's why Cain killed Abel. Third week, or last week, Blake talked about Noah's Ark and how God's wrath is real and how we're no longer children of wrath, but righteousness. And so we get to live that out. That doesn't mean that God's wrath doesn't exist, but we get to live out Jesus dying and us being in righteousness. And today, we're talking about Abraham. Probably one of the most influential people in the Bible. He's super important. I mean, people outside of Christianity call us an Abrahamic religion. We are the, what does it say? We are the children of Abraham, some will say. That's how important he is and how much he's talked about. And I can't stress enough how much I can't speak a lot about, I can't get into enough about Abraham. I have a point I'm going to make, but there's so many things you can dive into within Abraham's story. I mean, just this alone, I'm going to skim through like 10 to 12 chapters, and I'm skimming through 10 to 12 chapters. I'm not really getting into the weeds, and I encourage y'all to go read Genesis 12 through 22. That's just 10 chapters, which is what I'm going to be preaching through. But that being said, Abraham, we don't see him until he's actually 75 years old. So he's already an old man before we see him. We don't get much context before the beginning of his life. The most we get is like the really boring stuff of like, oh, this is who his father was, this is who his brother was, yada, yada, yada. This is where he lived. The stuff that like even bores me, and I love information. So that being said, we don't see him until he's like 75, maybe 77-ish years old, where he's living with his father in a place that's already established. They already have their family here. He has brothers. He has a wife. And that's when God comes to him. And it's like, hey, Abraham, even though you're already in this established place, I'm going to call you out of it. I'm going to call you to leave your comfort, leave this place that you have already grown with your father and your brothers and your family, and I'm going to tell you just go. Where? I don't know. I'm just telling you to go, and I'll tell you from there. So everybody, let's raise our Bibles, everyone. This is truth. This is life. This is God's Word. Let's open it together. We're going to open to Genesis 12, 1 through 3. So next week, Blake will actually get us out of Genesis. Oh, I already passed it. But we are going to read through this verse of God calling out Abraham out of his home. Now the Lord said to Abraham, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you great nation. And I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. and all your families of the earth shall be blessed. So Abraham already gets this call to just absolutely nowhere. Like, God just says, hey, go where I will tell you. He doesn't even tell you where to go. He just says, go where I will tell you. And so Abraham, believe it or not, just obeys. He says, okay. He grabs his wife, he grabs his brother Lot, and or his wife Sarah and his brother Lot, and they leave. They actually go, and it's a great thing because I know even if it is God, like God's like, hey, just go and leave to like the other side of the country to a new continent. I don't know if I would do it. But Abraham immediately obeyed, and it wasn't all sunshines and rainbows after he left. Immediately after he left, he went to this land that God called him to, and there was famine. Just immediately there was famine, or at least when we read through it, I'm sure there's years in between the stuff we read through. But when we read through it, there's famine, and he actually has to go away from the land he was called to just because of the famine. But that being said, he's called Abraham and said, hey, I'm going to make great nations out of you. Abraham is 75. Sarah is a little bit younger than him, within a decade, which I know that's a little bit younger, but still, when you're like 65, you're not exactly producing a lot of children. And at this time, Abraham didn't have any children. Abraham and Sarah, they didn't have any children together. They didn't have any children at all. And it was extremely shameful during this time to not have heirs or anybody to take up what you've built. Because then you have to like give it to your brother or someone else in your family. It wasn't as much as giving it to friends, but as someone in your bloodline. And so they're at this point where they've lost hope. They've lost all hope of having children. And then God comes in and promises Abraham, hey, I'm going to give you this land, and I'm going to make great nations out of you. And immediately Abraham's like, what? Like, you can actually read through it. Abraham doesn't believe it. He just hears God's call of like, hey, go, and he goes. But you can even see Abraham later arguing with God, like, how am I supposed to have children? I'm 75. Actually, Abraham laughed about having children when God's like, you're going to have children. He's like, I'm too old. And God was like, I'm God. I don't care. But that being said, God even came back to him. I believe it was either 2 or 3 times, and finally made a covenant with Abraham, saying, I am promise you children of your own, children with Sarah. And so after Abraham hears this great promise of receiving children and being the father of nations, what does he do? Well, like all of us, he immediately goes and sins. He immediately goes and has a child with his servant. Actually, Sarah was the one who even came up and said, hey, we're not going to have children, and you need to be father of great nations, so go and have a child with my servant Hagar. And so he did. He did exactly that, and they had a child, Hagar, and Abraham had a child named Ishmael. Abraham was about 86 at the time of this child. And even still then, God made a covenant with Abraham and came to him and said, I'm still going to give you your child. And this is actually with the point, if you were paying attention when I was reading that verse, you notice that his name wasn't Abraham at the time. God actually renames him. God does this a lot throughout the Bible, where he's like, okay, now you're going to follow me, and so I'm going to rename you, because like God can just do that. And like what he's doing is he's giving you a new identity to live in him. And so he's taking away the identity to live into him. That's a little bit of a sidetrack though, but yeah, Abraham had Ishmael, and then God came back and says, I'm still going to honor my covenant with you. And Abraham and Sarah started laughing. They both just didn't believe that he would have a child. And come 100 years old, Abraham and Sarah had a child. And so there was like really, for them, in their idea, they were both 100 at the time, about 100. They had no way out. They did not believe there was any way for them to have an heir to take up, or for him to be a father of nations with Sarah. There's absolutely zero way that they could possibly see a way out of this impossible mess. And so I'm going to go through a little bit of story of y'all where God kind of pulled me through something that I didn't think I could get out A couple years back, I'm only 20, so this is only a couple years ago. I was a senior in high school. I was actually in the second semester, the last semester of high school. And this is usually the time where you have a least amount of classes. You get to do a lot more of what you want to do. And while that was the same for me, I had less classes, I got to work more, I got to choose more of like dual enrollment classes and what I wanted to do, but I was miserable. Despite having more freedom than ever, despite being able to do what I want to do, I was completely miserable at the time. I was extremely depressed. I did not have a desire to live many days. I wasn't necessarily suicidal, but I just didn't want to get out of bed. I didn't want to go do anything. I didn't want to finish my work. I didn't want to go work. I didn't want to do this stuff. And I know a lot of y'all probably relate to this state. I was very lonely at the time too, because my graduating class kind of just pushed me out of the way. They just didn't care. Whenever they would have meetings and stuff during times that I was in class and couldn't attend those meetings. And so I felt isolated than ever. I was even getting counseling during this time because my parents forced me to, because they saw how much it affected me, how little I was making leeway on for work, and how stressed and depressed I was getting. And when talking to this counselor, she didn't even know what to do with me. Literally every week she was sitting there hey, just do your best, just do better. She wasn't actually doing any good counseling, and I think it was just that she was lost because she saw this kid that actually wanted to change, but he couldn't. He had no way out. And so I eventually did graduate college, but when I was in counseling, graduate high school. I realized I said that. But when I was in counseling, I realized the counselor was hey, you're really stressed by this school. You're really struggling right now. I think you should take a gap year after you graduate. And I was that's a great idea. Even my parents were here's a couple gap year programs you could do. I had money saved up from when I was working all through high school, so I had money saved up. And so the logical conclusion is, okay, I've got this idea of a gap year. I've had several people tell me and bring me and say, hey, you should do it because obviously this school thing is not working out for you, and I don't know if this is where God has you. And so I did exactly what Abraham did. I went to college after I graduated. Fall came, and I had actually received a new job. I was pool cleaning at the time, and I was working 8 to 12-hour days, and I was by myself. And this contributed even more to my depression. Because before, when I was working around a lot of people, and I get to talk to them, and now I'm even more isolated than I was before. I didn't have the graduating class. I didn't have any communities in college at the time, and so I was even more depressed. I couldn't get my work done. And for me, this was really hard because I knew the work. I went into a cybersecurity associate's degree, and I have been interested in IT all my life. This is actually why I went to college. It's because I knew I wanted to do something in IT. So I went to the cybersecurity thing. And these are the beginning classes of your degree, and so it's very basic stuff, and stuff I have already learned, stuff I already learned on my own. I was already doing this stuff at home because I was bored, and it was just an interest to me. And so I couldn't get this work done. The work that I already knew, I didn't even have to study for a quiz, and I could have aced it. And I couldn't bring myself to it. I was so depressed. I was so anxious then because I couldn't get my work done. And I just was miserable. I was in probably one of the darkest times of my life. I didn't want to live. And I was venting to Blake. And I was what am I doing? Why can't I get this? What am I doing wrong? Felt like a complete and total failure. I mean, it was causing so much strife in my life, just in my personal life. I mean, falling away from God causes the strife. I mean, it's the same thing that actually happened with Ishmael, because God promised Abraham Isaac, and so he gave him Isaac. Like I said, they had Isaac at 100, but Ishmael wasn't non-existent. Ishmael was still in the picture, and so when God gave Abraham Isaac and Ishmael was there was so much strife between Ishmael and Isaac. Ishmael was actually caught mocking Isaac a couple times. This made Sarah super mad, and Hagar was also mad at Sarah because Sarah was getting mad at Ishmael. And so there's just this whole dynamic of strife that everyone is like mad at everyone. It was so bad that God actually instructed Abraham, said, do whatever your wife thinks to do. And Abraham's wife was like, or Sarah was like, banish Ishmael. That was the solution, is to banish, to get rid of Ishmael entirely, remove Ishmael from the equation. God gave Abraham permission to banish his own son. And so, that's not the end of the story, though. Later, God commanded Abraham, this is a couple years later, Isaac's a little bit older. Ishmael and Hagar actually had an encounter with God, and so God actually blessed them. And so Hagar was actually doing pretty well at this time, but a little bit later, God commanded Abraham to take Isaac to a mountain and to sacrifice him. To take him to a mountain and offer him as a burnt sacrifice. And that's really rough. Like, imagine the promised child, and you've got this promise that God has given you, and it's a physical being right there. And God said, no, go to a mountain, and I want you to sacrifice it. Let's turn to Genesis 22, verses 6 through 8. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he went both of them together. And Isaac said to him, Father, my father. And he said, Here I am, my son. Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, God will provide for himself and the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they both went together. Even in this midst of Abraham having to travel up to a mountain, all he was thinking about was God will provide. God has to provide. God has provided already, so God will provide. And like Isaac at this time, like he's old enough to ask, like, where's the sacrifice? And so, like, how gut-wrenching is it to walk up this mountain where you're just sitting there and you know you're about to have to sacrifice your son? Abraham got to the point where he was about to sacrifice. He was about to sacrifice Isaac. But I want you to take a second and think about like what that equates to today, or how you see that today. God having a man sacrifice his own son. The world's going to tell you how evil that is and how destructive that is and how this is not a God we should worship. Go ahead and turn to Genesis 22, 9 through 14. But yeah, this is how destructive people describe God. Oh, look at him. And they don't read the full story. They don't say, hey, they just say, hey, look, he made him sacrifice his own son. They don't say, hey, let's read the rest of the story. Let's read the rest of the context. So 9 through 14. When they came to a place of which God had told them, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took a knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from the heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Do not lay your hand on that boy or do anything to him. For now that I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted his eyes, looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in the thickest by his thorns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, The Lord Will Provide. As it is said to this day, on the mountain of the Lord it shall be provided. God provided the sacrifice. See, we read into like, oh, he calls us to sacrifice. Yes, God calls us to sacrifice, but he also provides in that sacrifice. He didn't just let his promise go unfulfilled. He provided the sacrifice that was needed to be fulfilled. For me, I withdrew that semester of college after talking to Blake, and he really was just into me about like, what is God asking me to do? Because God wasn't asking me to go to college at the time. It was something that I wanted to do. It was not out of bad intention. It was something that I wanted to do, something that I saw was the only way to get to my goal, which was a God, like not out of God. Like I believe that I'm a man. I should have to sweat my brow. I should have a career. And so that's the career I think I would have a good fit for. But I saw the only way was a degree. And so that left me blind to what God could provide for me. So I withdrew from college that semester. I was miserable a little bit, but I eventually got better. And in February, because this was the fall semester, remember? In February, I got an IT job. I just walked into a door. Actually, my Dawson, the youth pastor here, came up and was like, "Hey, I met this guy. He's hiring. He's not hiring or anything, but he has an IT business." So I walked in that door and was like, "Hey, I want a job." I eventually got hired in February, and for me, that was amazing. I shouldn't have got that job. Like, I had no experience in IT. I had nothing on a piece of paper. My resume was like, "Hey, I worked at Chick-fil-A," and yet I was given grace and mercy by God, and He gifted me that job. He didn't have to. There was no reason to. He provided for me. And so my question today is, what's your Ishmael? What is the thing that you're creating and you're not letting God take over and make the sacrifice? See, with all these stories that we're reading, we can see a general theme. When you're taking it into your hands, suffering is what produces. So where in life are you suffering that it produces because you are taking control, not because of God? Because the moment that Abraham said, "Hey, I'm going to obey God to the letter," and that meant sacrificing his own son, God provided. It's so easy for God to provide when you just follow Him. What's your Ishmael? It could be college like me. It could be your career. It could be your friends. It could be the time you spend in your free time, video games. That was something I had to personally give up. It could be all of these things that you are not getting rid of your life. It could be when you're going to church. Like, it could be where you're going to church. You could be choosing to go to the wrong church. Like, that is a thing. God will call you to churches. And He will call you out of churches to new beginnings. So what is your Ishmael? Where in your life are you trying to provide where God can provide? Lord, I just thank You for this day. I thank You for this opportunity that You just give me to come up here and preach and really practice serving You. And I pray to do this some more. I pray for everyone here. I pray that You just let them linger on this word. And pray that you just pull out what You want them to follow You in, where You want them to stay. I pray that You just give them the answer of where You need to provide for them. In Jesus' name, amen. My bad, TJ.